Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. With Masters of the Air recently concluding, we welcome our first guest from the show, military advisor Captain Dale Dye. Captain Dale will talk us through how his experience in the Marines and working on previous war epics helped craft the show's military authenticity. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Captain Dale. Hi, Captain Dale. Thank you for joining me today.
Sure, I'm glad to be here. Thanks very much. We're all very excited. Here in the U.S., the first episode of Masters of the Air drops tomorrow, so we're all very excited to take a look at.
I think we're quite excited on this side of the pond as well, and talking to sort of my family members and the average Joe as well. Like, people are quite buzzed about it, and I guess with it being sort of like the unofficial third part of the Band of Brothers sort of, not saga, because it's not involved with it. It's like a spiritual sequel rather than a direct one, as it has the same sort of producing team behind it, but it's a complete different story, obviously.
Well, look, it is no question the third part of the Spielberg-Hanks World War II trilogy, which began with Band of Brothers, which has lived a life of its own and still continues to live a life of its own, followed by the Pacific, and now Band of Brothers, now Masters of the Air. And it's an interesting story. It's a story that we know a little bit about, but I don't think we know the emotions that were involved. There's a tendency to think of airmen, especially airmen flying bombers, as being detached somehow from what was going on the ground, where you were looking in the enemy's beady ass eyeballs. That wasn't the case with bomber crews. But that said, the risk involved in flying in a B-17 over Nazi-occupied Europe during the days of World War II were monumental, were staggering, the losses that they took. So we're really very happy to be giving people a look at this side of that war.
I guess as well that there's always this photo that gets posted up every few months on like something like Twitter, which is a picture of a bomber with all the red dots of where it was shot at, and there's like the famous story of like why isn't certain areas, other areas being shot at and not been destroyed. And I think they decided, and then the story behind it is that they decided to strengthen the areas that were shot up, because that's the places that were most likely to draw fire. But I guess as well as being airman, you're stuck how many thousand feet up in the air in a metal in a plane. There's no way to get out. Like, the horror of that itself is the same with like you're in a confined space with nowhere to go, and you need to sort of just make sure that there's people who are flying the plane, there's people who are manning the guns as well, and it's just like, yeah, it's just amazing to like, you would really know the true horrors of it unless you experience it completely yourself.
Well,
But
look, there's a reason they called that aircraft the Flying Fortress, because it could take some significant damage. And every time it flew, it risked significant damage, not only from flak, German AAA anti-aircraft artillery, but from the Luftwaffe flying at it. And it would bring you home, assuming the damage was anywhere near survivable. The problem is, as you point out, you're in an aluminum tin can at 10,000 feet on oxygen with temperatures below freezing, and there's really no escape. You can't dive into a foxhole. You can't cover yourself up with dirt and logs and that sort of thing. You simply have to sit there and take it. And that's what they did. And that's the frightening part of flying those missions that I think we're going to bring to the screen that people don't understand.
And I think as well, like, as a another story point of telling a different point of view of the war, because I think what we learn at school, you learn about D-Day, you learn about what is it, the war at home in terms of how people coped, evacuees. But I didn't feel like we learned enough about the boys up in the air. There was a sort of mention about Battle of Britain, but there isn't. I never. There's nothing something that stood out to us whilst we're learning. And I've got Polish heritage, so we also learnt about what was happening in sort of Eastern Europe as well. Like my granddad ended up in Siberia and ended up after he left there, joining the Second Corpus to end up in Africa and then Europe. So there's sort of like there's a lot that I'd still like to learn as well. And when Band of Brothers came out, that was like a weekly viewing for like my dad and brother and I. That 9 o'clock, he said, "I've only got a couple of rules if you want to watch it. Make sure that you're washed, your teeth are brushed, you're ready. So once it's finished, you can go to bed, and but you can watch it."
Yeah, listen, it was interesting to be shooting. I mean, I gave about 10 and a half months of my life living in the UK. It wasn't the first time, but it was a very interesting time. And one of the things that we bring out in the story that I think will be so interesting to British audiences is the differences between the way the Allies, in this case, the US and the UK, approached bombing in World War II in Nazi-occupied Europe. The RAF, we make this perfectly clear through confrontations that typically happen in pubs. We make this perfectly clear that the British believed that the way to do this, the RAF, believed that the way to do this was nighttime area bombing. That saved lives and struck the most targets and that sort of thing. Whereas when the US came in, they said, no, that's not the way we do it. We'll do it daytime, high-level precision bombing. And that was constantly a constant point of contention between the Allies in this particular thing. And I don't know which side was eventually right. All I know is that they did it simultaneously. The Americans flew in the day and the Brits flew at night. And the point was that they got heavy ordnance on targets throughout occupied Europe. But that particular, unless you're a historian and have read about the various viewpoints of how to do this, that's something that not many people know, that there was a dispute between how to accomplish this bombing mission. And rather than solve the dispute one way or the other, they just did them both. And you'll see that in Masters of the Air.
I think that's quite funny because it just shows the sort of different viewpoints of how people would fight a war. But then in that sort of different viewpoints, kind of, I guess you can have that sort of hidden geniusy of it because you'd have just constant planes going day and night. So whoever you're fighting against will always need to be aware of what's going on and what's going to be coming next. Which again, it seems like a crazy thing to think about now, because in hindsight, because it's what a great thing. But at the time, you're at war, you're going to do whatever you think is best to win, and not have what's the word? Not hesitate. You're going to be very confident in your decision because this is the way that we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to make sure that we succeed.
Well, look, one of the things that we needed to point out, and we were at pains to point this out in the storytelling that we do in Masters of the Air for 9 episodes, is that it was in many ways a very different kind of war. Not only were you not standing on the ground at rifle point looking at the enemy, you were detached in some ways, way above all the action and all that sort of thing. But you also flew a 8 or 10-hour mission over flak-filled skies full of the Luftwaffe trying to knock you down in braced-up formations of bombers, hundreds of bombers and streams going across the channel. But if you survived that sort of thing, and the odds were against you, remember, it was a crapshoot, and the odds were against you. But if you survived, you came home to some base in East Anglia. In the case of the 100 Bomb Group Heavy, Thorpe Abbots, and you were in essence in a garrison life. You were no longer faced with direct combat with the enemy. You could go to the pub, you could go to movies, you could, whatever was available in the English countryside was available to you under wartime conditions, of course. And so we show that aspect of it. And in some ways, as a combat veteran myself, I can tell you this, that must have made it more difficult. Look, it's one thing to be committed to combat. Now, here you go. You're going to do this, and you're going to live or you're going to die, and you're going to give it your best effort to stay alive. But you're always going to be in that situation, except if you're flying in an 8th Air Force outfit or an RAF outfit flying over Europe, you come home, spend some time in a non-combat situation, and then have to spool yourself back up the next morning at 0400 or whatever it is, go to the next briefing and know you're going to have to do it again. In some ways, and many of the surviving veterans I've talked to have mentioned this, in some ways, it would have been easier if it was just all the time slam bang action, but you had that downtime in between, and that always made it tougher to spool back up.
It's interesting to hear those sort of views that it's better to be on the front line the whole time rather than back and forth, just because, as you said, you'd survive that moment. Like there'll be an ounce of normality by going to the pub, talking to people, seeing people, but then, as you said, spooling back up and getting yourself mentally prepared to go again, where you know what's coming, but you don't know what area it's coming from. That must give you like a whole different sort of sense of anxiety and fear and sort of thinking about that, like, here we go again. And it's like kind of, I like reliving a nightmare effectively.
Yeah, that's right. It's, Groundhog's Day. It just never quits. You know it's coming, and to some extent, that'll make you misbehave in the downtime because there might never be another night of fun. This may be the only opportunity you get, and that to some extent might explain some of the behavior that you see from the Yanks. Oversexed, overpaid, and over here, which is what the Brits normally thought of us during the war. And that may explain some of the activities. You just never knew. You were going to take off the next day on some kind of horrendous bombing mission, facing all these dangers. And Lord knows whether you're going to make it home at all. And if you do, you're going to make the most of it. And then you've got to spool back up. That anxiety is always there, and you know it's coming. There's no downtime. You're just going to have that brief period between missions, and then you're off again. So that was one of the sort of psychological aspects of service in the 100th Bomb Group Heavy and all the others that were over flying from East Anglia during the war that we really wanted to demonstrate in some ways, and I think we did.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see that aspect as well. And as audience members, we could be amazed about the action and how it's recreated, but then it's also what's important is about the characters and the people, and with it based on true events and true stories. You want to really connect with the characters and actually understand that there's more to them than them being in the Air Force and flying these planes, and that there's always somebody real behind in the cockpit. And it's not just a video game. But what I'm curious to know about, because as a military advisor, you were in the Marines previously, and when it comes to being military advisor, where you're talking about various sections of armies, so in this case, you're talking about the Air Force, how do you go about preparing for your role and to sort of discuss with crew, actors about how to create that authenticity on screen?
Well, look, this was a difficult one. Neither myself or any of my staff were, except for a couple of technical guys that we had with us, were aviators. We were combat veterans, and there was kind of a well, if you've seen one war, in many ways you've seen them all. But we knew that this was a specific challenge because we hadn't been aviators. So we thought it over and said, look, here's the deal. There's no question that when a young man enlisted in the United States Army Air Force in the 1940s during World War II, he had to be a soldier before he became an airman. So we designed a 2-week sort of syllabus beginning as it always does with our methodology, with physical training, to get them focused and build that camaraderie that's so important. And we said, look, we're going to walk, crawl, and then run. So we're going to start with the minutia. How do you wear the uniform? How do you march in formation? How do you learn to rely on the guy on your left and the guy on your right? And that's part and parcel of soldiery. That's the heart of soldiery. So we began to teach that. And then we worked ourselves up into how does that apply to the United States Army Air Force in the 1940s? What was their structure like? Who were the personalities involved in that? What was life like? Training to become an air gunner or a navigator or a bombardier or a radio operator or a pilot or a co-pilot. And how did all of that how did that deck of cards get shuffled together into 10 men that could accomplish a mission in a B-17? So that's the approach we took. Now, I'm fortunate, my executive officer, Mike Stokey, who's been with me through Band of Brothers and the Pacific and all the other ones, his dad was a B-29 pilot during the war. And I had an uncle who was a reluctant tail gunner in the 8th Air Force on B-17s. And so we had, some familial stories, some apocryphal stories from our relations about what went on. And we used that kind of as a shoehorn to get us into the attitude of this thing. But the important thing was these young actors, and at one point we had over 100 of them gathered together in classrooms. We had them for about 12 hours a day. And we knew that we had to teach them to soldier before we could teach them to aviate, if you will. And it was a little difficult because when we had done Band of Brothers, when we had done the Pacific, we owned them. We owned them for 24 hours a day. They lived with us in barracks or they slept with us in remote campsites. And they learned to live in the environment. And that helped mentally put them in that place. When we were doing this one, Masters of the Air in UK, we weren't afforded that luxury. We could have them for about 12 hours a day. And that was initially very disappointing. I said, boy, they're going to miss the team building effort that comes after so-called classroom hours and that sort of thing. They're going to miss making that connection, that mesh. And it turned out the more we thought about it, actually that mirrors what happened with the real guys in the 8th Air Force flying out of East Anglia. They went out on missions and they returned home. And as we talked about before, they did whatever they could do to keep their mind off what was going to come next. And then they flew the next mission the next day. So in some ways, the fact that we had to release them every day rather than keep them overnight played into our hands because it kind of introduced them to the lifestyle. And as it turned out, because of the exercises that we did and a number of other things, that meshing, that team building wasn't missed at all. They picked that up right away. And we forced it on them. We forced it on them by making them understand the selfless nature of service. And as anybody who's ever worn the uniform knows, that's the heart and soul of the beast. You are not important. What's important is the mission and the survival of the unit, the trust that you build with the guy on your right, the guy on your left. That's the heart and soul of it. And that's where we had to get. And I think we did it over about a 2-week period of forcing it down their throats.
I think what's quite interesting is that the beginning is that if you were to be in the Air Force, you need to be a soldier first and going through that training before sort of stepping to the side to be an airman. Because that's something I didn't know, but it kind of makes sense because you need to, I guess, learn the fundamentals of what it's like to be an army. And then being an airman is a bit more of a specialist thing because you're in a plane or you have a specific job being a navigator or a gunner, a pilot, and so on. And then because it's not your first time as well, working with such a large group of people, mainly because of having it done before with Band of Brothers and the Pacific, I guess it was kind of like riding a bike putting together what your class would be like and being like, okay, this is how we're going to get them. This is what we're going to do to bring that out of them and
Well,
how
it's
to
always
sort of
something.
thing.
It's always something that surprises you, and you got to figure your way out of it. But yeah, it was good to have done it with that large a group before.
And then do you find it when you have such a large group, I guess as like actors, they're going to be like sponges on what's happening and what they're going to be taking in because it's whatever they're learning in class is going to be so vital to when they're going to be shooting. Do you find that everybody's very are all sort of concentrating max to the max and that they're taking it all in, or do you have like the odd person like at school who might be a bit of a mess around or be a bit of a troublemaker?
Of course you do. Of course you've got that guy, and sometimes you've got a bunch of that guys. Well, but we fix it real quick. Young actors, in particular, have grown up thinking that the sun rises and sets on them. It's all about me. How's my hair? How do I look? How many lines do I have in this scene? And that's the antithesis of the way the military does business. We think about the mission, the unit, and our survival comes last. So you've got to wake them up that this is a unique experience, that they've got to open their hearts and open their mind to that particular concept. And the way we tend to do it is, well, we have an old tradition in farming America, where you've got a mule that's pulling the plow, and sometimes the mule really doesn't want to go where you want the mule to go. So the mission is you pick up a 2x4 and you whack that mule right between the eyes, and suddenly he pays attention. Well, our 2x4 in this case is physical training, and we do that sort of thing. That choreographed running together, chanting, doing press ups and atomic sit ups, and caterpillar push ups, and all the exercises that we've developed over the years. And suddenly they say, you know what? There's something to this. Isn't it cool? The strength of a unit as opposed to the strength of an individual. And eventually the light begins to go on. And for us, that's really the Academy Award. That's really the Oscar. That's the first place trophy. That's the gold medal. If you see that light go on, if you see that moment of epiphany in the eyes of these young men, when suddenly they say, aha, that's it. That's what he's trying to teach us. That's what he's trying to tell us. This guy's more important than this guy. This guy and this guy are more important than I am. And eventually you'll get that. And when they do get, the focus becomes on telling the story that they're tasked with. The focus becomes on embodying their character, not just to be a star, not just to garner screen time, but to assist in the telling of the story. And that's what we had to reach. Now, it took some doing with some individuals, but we did it. And I'm very proud of the performances of virtually all of them.
I guess as well, like as being someone who, as a teacher as well, it's and making people understand what is important because it's not just. I know in the military they have it. You were mentioning about how everybody's got a job. And it's like no one's important. The sun doesn't rise because of you. But when you're with such a large group as well, and you have that moment of people understanding like what is important when you're there, who you have on your right hand, who when you look to your right and when you look to your left, that's the person that you want to be in a plane with, and somebody that you're going to trust to pull you out of the excuse my language, out of the shit when the shit hits the fan.
Sure.
But as well with someone with so many people at the same time when you're working with people, like that must be kind of difficult to when, as you said, with people that sometimes it would take them a little bit extra time to grasp what is happening. That is something that I'd probably find quite interesting as if I was in your shoes, because then it's like trying to sort of lead them into that way to think how you have thought when you've been serving as well. And then once
Look,
they,
any teacher, any instructor that has ever had to impart knowledge or impart technical skill to an audience, to a class, knows that element of it. And the key is you can't stop in the middle of everything and pay close attention to that guy, but you have to find out who he is. You have to see that cloud over his head that says, I don't really get this. I don't understand. And then you're called on to spend more time with him. So when everybody else is doing something else, you pull him aside and you talk to him. Say, listen, what's the matter? What aren't you getting? What don't you see? I'm here to teach you. Tell me what you don't see. And when you have those moments, then he feels a little bit, he's not embarrassed by being singled out in public, but he knows that you're there to teach him and you want to help him. And that's how you get over that. But it always happens. You're exactly right.
And because I wouldn't say I've had a similar experience, but I used to be part of the Polish Scouts. So there'll be times where you'd be with people, it'd be peeing down with rain for 24 hours and, all your morale's low. But if you look to the right, look to your left, then you're kind of with those people in your tent, knowing that, you know what?
Sure.
I could be in a worse tent with someone else, or our
Sure.
tent could be collapsing right now. And it's like we're kind of just keeping each other's spirit and mood going, which is something that's also quite important as like just to create that authenticity on screen, is that camaraderie and just that sort of spirit that's created amongst one another. And even like the chemistry to know that if people are best friends, and how it's one thing having it written for you that you're best friends, but it's like showing that on screen in the way that you might look at one another, the way that the sort of in jokes that you'll have, the always backing up one another as well in certain situations.
Well, that's the asset. That's the value of the way we do it. Look, it's called acting. I get that. And you can read the script, and the script says you're this guy's best friend, and you don't know him from Adam's off ox until you walk on the set, unless you've spent some time with him and you've got to know him. And in 2 weeks of intensive training, you can get to know him. And suddenly, it's not hard to envision him. It's not hard to make that projection into him being a very important aspect of your life. And that's the key. Give them that extra ammunition. And that's what we try to do.
When you talk about training, because there's the physical side, but when it comes to the more technical side of when each actor has their role and their job on a plane, how do you go about teaching those classes? Is it a case of everybody's there whilst you're going through each job, or is it a case that everybody's split into groups and you'll take each group on to, excuse the pun, master their role?
Well, as we moved through the basic training and got them soldiered up, if you will, we began the technical aspects of it, and we had two really important B-17 experts with us. And so, as we began to examine each during the training days, some of the pilots and co-pilots would spend time with the pilots themselves, the B-17 experts, and learn switchology and that sort of thing within the cockpit. We would take the gunners into separate sections of the aircraft and teach them the ins and outs of firing the M2 50 caliber heavy barrel machine gun that was part of their weaponry at their station. Bombardiers and navigators had to learn what happens up in the nose. What's the Norden bomb sight about? How do you use it? And so that all became, after we finished the basic training, that all became part of their ongoing continual technical training. And it went on just forever. We were very fortunate because at some point, our set designers and builders had actually made 2 full-scale B-17s, absolutely spot on down to the rivets. And one of which we could even move around the airbase like a remote controlled car. So they would do everything but fly. And so it was very easy then to get the young men into their position and let them get a feel of what it must have been like in there. And then when we began shooting, we used a system where they were surrounded. It wasn't a single green screen sort of thing. They were literally surrounded by the scenery that was happening in the air according to the script. And so we put them in the environment continuously. And the more you did it, the more they became imbued with the danger and the feel of what it was like in there. We had sections of aircraft that were mounted on gimbal and then the gimbals are will rock and roll a section of fuselage and all that sort of thing under computer control. And then we would surround that section with imagery, so that when you looked up, left, right, it looked exactly like it would have to the B-17 crews. And this really added to it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the special effects in Masters of the Air have got to be the star of the show. It's one of the most extraordinary, eye-popping spectacles I've ever seen.
From my understanding, they had the Lux, which is the LED panels built in a studio. So when they were in the cockpit, there were actors could look out and see that they were actually in the air, which is it's probably so much easier to imagine than green screen when you just look at a green drape, and actually probably having that more of a visceral feeling to it all.
Oh, it was absolutely impressive. Not only were you literally were in the world, because the world surrounded you 360 degrees. I mean, it wasn't just look one way and there's something projected on the screen. It was, you were in the environment. It literally wrapped around you. And with no combat flying experience myself, just being in there and looking around, oh my God, I had no idea that it looked that way and must have felt that way. And I think that really gave the young actors an impetus. That gave them a leg up at doing this sort of thing. Acting frightened, for instance, or surprised by something was easy when you're in that sort of thing, or it was easier. And what you want to remember is that most of this action took place above 10,000 feet AGL, above ground level, and that meant that they were on oxygen all the time. So you've got an oxygen mask, and all you see is the eyes. So there was a lot of face acting that had to go on. And it was much easier, given the fact that they were literally surrounded by these images.
I think having that experience of being surrounded by the images as well, as you said as well, you've never been up in the air fighting wise. You've obviously been on the plane because you would have come over from America to the UK, but having that sort of experience was like if you were sitting in a gunner position and seeing it all around you, or as you said, right at the nose of the plane and seeing the battle unfold with that. But then also the idea of knowing that, like the geography of how your movements would work. So if you're flying the plane, sorry, then you'd know that when you're looking outside, you could see how your plane would move, and then also how you would dodge other planes in the sky if there was a bit of a dogfight happening as well.
Yeah, and there were literally during the war, especially during the heavy days of 1944, 1945, there were literally streams of bombers crossing the channel. And there were hundreds of planes in the air, all flying in tight formations. So it was a whole different experience. It wasn't like climbing in your 737 MAX and whipping from LAX to Heathrow. This was a jam-packed sky. It wasn't a lonely sky. You maybe felt a bit alone tucked in the ball turret underneath the belly of a B-17, but look around you, and there were just hundreds of aircraft from your squadron, from your group, just streaming across the channel. So that was an aspect of it that I think you're going to see that I think it really surprised me. I mean, just the imagery of it. I knew the numbers. I knew that there were literally hundreds of bombers on a particular strike. I'd read the history, but when you're seeing it, it really comes home. You realize that it's just not catching a commercial airliner and hopping over across the continental United States. It was up in there, and not only is it up in there, everybody is so tight that you can't afford to make a mistake. And here comes flak, so heavy that you can walk on it sometimes. And then here comes the Luftwaffe with rockets and machine guns trying to break up those formations. I mean, this was a hell of a deal, and you get that feel when you're surrounded by it. There's no place. It's a lonely sky. There's no place to go.
As someone who's fought in war and has worked on a lot of project over the years, you would have seen how technology has changed and how different ways people are shooting things. But how would you compare seeing what you saw with this technology compared to previous films? Is that something that just would something like this like have blown you away to just be like, wow, I can't believe this is how far we've gotten now in filmmaking?
Well, it was certainly a seminal moment for me as a filmmaker. I didn't realize we could go that far, and we certainly can, and we did. But I was more used to the epics in which we're on the ground, and weather and terrain, actual weather and terrain plays an element of it. So you're not surrounded by computer generated imagery. And I knew that it was going to be a heavy special effects effort. There's no way it couldn't be, given the story that we had to tell. But I didn't realize how advanced that technology had gotten and how expert. Now, it took literally hundreds of people every day, controlling the computers and controlling the imagery that we saw and controlling the motion of the aircraft and all that sort of thing. Some of that's been done. But I think the extent to which we do it in Masters of the Air, to me, was just a revelation. And I think it'll be a revelation to audiences.
I think with audiences, you'll probably feel it more as well, the authenticity of the dogfights and being up there and feeling the
Well, remember,
claustrophobic nature.
remember the key to this is computer generated imagery and special effects are only workable, are only admirable, and only applicable if you don't notice them. Now, I don't know how you're not going to notice these spectacular effects, but the idea is that you need to make them blend into the story so that they aren't a standalone thing. I mean, this isn't a Marvel Comics deal. This is an actual story. And so the key was making sure that while the special effects had to be spectacular, no question, they had to not be so spectacular that they drew away from the telling of the story. And I think we accomplished that. And really, in my view as a filmmaker, that was the key. If you can get there so that you're seeing spectacular special effects, but not to the detriment of the story, in support of the story. And if you can get there and keep people from just going goggle-eyed at the special effects and pay attention to the story, then you've done it.
Because the creative team behind the show has worked on the previous on Band of Brothers and Pacific. I think they'll be able to balance between the spectacle and the story and not take it away. And you're right about visual effects. It's like a good aid in filmmaking, but it's important that what is shown on screen doesn't take you out, or as you said, like it doesn't mess with your sort of eyes as well, being like, wow, something's a bit awful with this one. But there's something as well that I wanted to talk about, which you mentioned earlier, and it was about uniforms and how they should be worn. Now because clothing has changed so much over the years, and also uniforms are probably slightly changed in terms of the material and maybe how certain things might sit on people now. But I'm guessing like the fundamentals haven't changed in terms of it always needs to be pristine. They need to be looked after. Your uniform is everything. No dust, nothing to be out of shape. How do you get actors, who live in a modern day, to understand the value of the uniform and also how they should be wearing it and how it should sit on them as well?
Well, that's a difficulty. All you have to do is take a look at the way the average young man dresses on the streets of London, and you know that that's going to be a difficulty. And I'm not singling out London. You can look in Dallas and Los Angeles and New York. So there is a tendency to not think about your appearance in uniform, because it's uniform. It's one form. You have to look like the next guy. Well, generally, civilians don't want to do that. They want to look like themselves. They would have some unique aspect of what they wear and how they look. So you got to defeat that. Now, we were lucky to have one of the best, most outstanding wardrobe and costume departments on Masters of the Air that I've ever worked with. These really, really good folks. And they did their research. And they had a lot to do. It wasn't just the off-duty uniform, the service dress uniform that we see most of our guys in. It was the flight equipment. And it was right down to the stitch, the way they got these. The blue suit underwear, the electric suits that they used to plug into the electrical system of the aircraft, the heated suits, all of the leather flight gear, the hats and the helmets, and all of that was a real challenge for those people. And they stepped up marvelously. They did some work that was staggering. I mean, they actually, I'm supposed to be the expert, but they knew stuff I had never heard of. And so when you start there, and say, look, you have to understand, young man, the concept of uniform. Separate the word uni, one, form, shape. And that's essentially what you're trying to do here. And the uniform and the way you wear it is part and parcel, is an expression of your pride in not yourself, but in your unit, in the United States, in the country that you represent. And therefore, walking around like a slouch and not having your tie squared away and not having your hat on correctly and not having your brass shined and leaving your blouse unbuttoned and all that, that's nonsense. You cannot and must not do that, because it reflects badly on you, your training, your unit, your country. You can't do that. And that's how you go at it. I mean, that's the approach that you make. And after a while, once they get used to the restrictive nature of a uniform, and that they can't wear it, down around their butt, and they can't, just slouch in and leave it unbuttoned, slouch in whatever they want to, or wear the hat on the back of their head. Once they realize that that's not an option, that's not going to happen. And it's not only not going to happen with you, it's not going to happen with anybody that's wearing that uniform. Then they pick it up. They say, yeah, okay, I get this. This is not my jeans and sweatshirt. This is something that represents what I'm doing and who I am now in service to my nation. And so they tend to police themselves after a while. Early on, you always have to walk through and say, button your blouse or I'll rip your head off. And then they do that. But after a while, they begin to police themselves, and it's nice to see.
Yes, because uniform is such a big thing, and as you said, like if you, there's so much importance with it as well. Like the idea of how much pride you need to take is that the fact is that it's not just an item of clothing that you're wearing. It's in service of something. It's in service of your country and how you're representing it, not just necessarily when you're down the street, but also if you're at functions or if you're popping to the shops to get a milk, or at the pub as well. And having those items and those little things of how it should be worn is always adds to the authenticity of what's seen on screen, but also how your look is. And I think in terms of taking pride in how you're looking as well is another thing as well that could play a part in it.
Sure, and it goes beyond the uniform. It's your posture, it's your carriage, it's how you handle yourself in public, how you stand, how you present yourself, how you speak, whether or not you've gotten a haircut within the past 2 weeks. All of that's important. Now, things were different. Styles were different in the 1940s, and we recognize that. So not everybody has got a buzz cut. They were allowed a certain latitude and that sort of thing, and you'll see that. But they very quickly understood that all of that nonsense with long hair and beards and all of that just got in the way of everything. And so they got rid of it. And very quickly they got used to the idea that, this gives me a certain pride in my presentation. It gives me a certain pride in my carriage. It gives me what old soldiers call military presence. Now, an actor would say, well, that's stage presence. No, it's military presence. And that's what you need to present at all times. And I think we did that.
And I think as well, like maybe there's just like a difference because when they're saying, "Oh, it's stage presence," and you're saying, "No, it's military presence," there's probably a massive difference as well in the way that those two are sort of not defined but put into practice in real life. Whilst stage presence, it's only there for however long somebody's on screen or doing a play or whatever. But that military presence is something that's probably going to stay with you for the rest of your life.
Well, if you're taught correctly, and if you understand the pride that generates, the self pride that generates, and the image that conveys to anyone who sees you, then you're probably right. It will stay with you for the rest of your life. It certainly has for me, and practically every ex-soldier that I know.
Yes, and it's like I think this, I guess because it's like so drilled into you that there's certain things that you will take pride in, or there's certain things you'll do. Like I guess like one of the most simple things is like making your bed in the morning. There's people that I know who are adults and they don't make their beds, and something like that drives me crazy because it's something that takes about 30 seconds of your day, and it's a
Yeah,
good way to start your day as well.
a good way to start your day. Sure, it's the first thing you've accomplished successfully in that day.
What I'm curious to know about as well is like, what is your collaboration like with other departments? We've talked about how some planes have been built, and also working with the costume department. But what's it like when you're working with somebody like the production design and set decorating? Are you involved in how certain things might look in an army base, for example, or is that just down to them and their research team?
Well, certainly their research teams do an immaculate job. But I'm happy to say, and it goes along with the fact that I did Band of Brothers in the Pacific and Saving Private Ryan and a number of other things. They kind of they want me involved. They want me to double check their work. They want me to spot holes. They want me to what about this or what about that? Something they might not have thought of. So there's a very close collaboration between my military department and all of the other support departments. Set designs, production designs, props, wardrobe, all of these things, weapons. I'm called in to check their work on everything, and I'm glad to do that because it produces a sort of a synergy. It produces a we're all here to tell this great story in the best way that we can. So let's call in every asset we have and double check each other's work and make sure we're doing the right thing. Yeah, and that's what keeps me busy when I'm not doing anything else. I'm in one department or another trying to help out.
I can imagine that aspect being kind of quite fun as well, because it's like a game of like Where's Waldo in a way of like
Yeah,
can you spot anything that might not be right? For
sure.
example, like a plug that might somebody might have picked out with what they're building, as an example. But then also,
And British spelling of things. Well,
yes,
I used to many of the bases that 8th Air Force bomb groups and squadrons flew them were former RAF bases in East Anglia for the most part. And I used to spend days before we were actually going to a location to shoot to go out there and check every one of the buildings that was we were going to shoot in the next couple of days. And every time I would come through and there would be some British spelling of something. And I would say, guys, look, I know this is a pain in the butt, but Americans don't spell it that way, and you can't do it that way. Eating in a mess hall, Europeans have a different way of handling their knife and fork than Americans do, and it's that kind of minutia that you need to keep an eye on. So yeah, it happened all the time. British spelling makes me crazy, and I'm sure American spelling makes you crazy. But the point is, we had to get it the American way before we shot it.
I can only just imagine that like there must have been a certain phrase that must is like Captain Dale Day. when he comes to expect all your work. And I can imagine certain people just sweating me like, please, 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 please.
Well,
Uh,
they got to the point where they knew it was coming, and they would run through and check it themselves, and they'd say, "How do Americans spell this?" And it would always be that extra re that instead of er that you put in, that sort of thing. And there were a number of other little eccentricities, I call them, that were Britishisms. And I said, "Gosh, you got to get rid of this." So the sign painters would follow me around and make notes and fix it all. But it was good fun, and we caught it before we committed it to film. So
yeah, because I think if you commit it to film, then now with people being so eagle-eyed and can
oh
go
yeah,
through frame by frame, people would be
wearing out
sort
the
of,
pause button. Yeah.
yeah, will be sort of posting stuff online to say, oh, look at this, look how bad this is, or
Oh,
how
and
did
it's
someone do this?
going
And
to
you're like,
happen.
oh,
You know it's going to happen this time. I mean, I'm used to it now. I tried to catch everything, but I didn't, and I couldn't. And I'm going to hear about it from those pause button commandos that will spend all day looking at it, and that's okay. The key to that is it's more about them watching it, even if they're being critical to it. So I'm glad to see it. It's okay. I'll say I screwed up, and I'll gladly do that. But I don't think we're going to see a lot of
you know what? I think that's such a good phrase, pause button commandos. I think that needs to be trademarked now because that's
Probably so.
perfect. Just to hit with my penultimate question as well, because we mentioned about working with the authenticity with production design and how it looks, but what's it like working on a show with different directors? Because there is an overall goal of how the story needs to be told, but then there's also different blocks of when directors work, and each director is very different in their vision. Or in the case on this show, there was a duo directors as well, so you'd have two people directing episodes as well.
Yeah, it's the nature of this beast. It's the nature of the miniseries beast that you end up with hot and cold running directors. And part of our mission was to sort of be the continuity. I'm your military advisor. I'm here at your elbow, and I want to make sure that you don't do something outlandish that the previous director didn't, that it wouldn't mesh and nobody would understand that sort of thing. So I have a little bit of that mission going. But each director, has been vetted for their skill, for their talent, and they've all read the script. And they've not only read their little portion of it, they've read everything that's available. So you don't get a lot of challenges to continuity. You get some different approaches to camera work, some different approaches to directing actors, but the story is always there, and they are always there to serve the story. So it's less of a problem than you'd think.
Yeah, I guess as you said, you're there to serve the story. I guess it's always in my mind that the issues that would just be the way that people had worked, and break down what's going on. But if you're the elbow who's sort of leading these directors into the right direction of how the feel and how the authenticity needs to feel like, they kind of have to listen because you are the expert. It's the same with like if you were at a doctor's office and they said you need surgery on your knee, you're not going to say, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not going to listen to the expert about it, am I?"
No, and that's the good part about it. I mean, look, they all want to do the best job they can. They know that they're involved in a production that is produced by Spielberg and Hanks. Nobody wants to screw it up. And so they're very anxious to have you take a look. What do you think? Is that the way to go at this, or sometimes you can say, look, um, that's great the way you've set this up, the way you've rehearsed that, but here's an element that's really critical to the story. Like, where is the gunner? Where's the ball turret gunner in this particular? Where's the ball turret in its rotation in this particular scene? That's important. And it's going to be important to fanboys and the people who know these stories and know these aircraft. So sometimes you point that out and they say, oh, okay. And they'll make a little adjustment. You rarely get into an argument. I've never heard on this production, at least, I've never heard anybody say, who cares? Come on, that's minutia. No, they pay attention.
I think if somebody turned around and said, "Who cares?" then I think they'll be getting their pink slip very quickly, or P45 in the UK, because
Yeah,
as you said, it is
that
like
kind of
what.
attitude doesn't fly in this particular thing, and nobody wants to do that with a production that is in essence the capstone of the trilogy, the World War II trilogy by Spielberg and Hanks. You don't want to screw that up, and you want to take any chances with pissing everybody off because you've decided you're going to do it your way, and that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I think, but even as having those sort of resources at your disposal to turn around and say, "Oh, like who cares?" then it's not. Obviously, that's completely the wrong thing, but it's also just you're wasting what you have in front of you in terms of what
Yeah,
you can use. I think that's like another big thing as well, just because you, as you said, even when like how somebody a gunner would be positioned, if somebody was coming from the left, they would be actually pointing this way, they'll be sitting this way, and understanding the geography of what movement and what's going on.
yeah.
It's like it's
It's
those
its
sort of
own kind
things.
of it's its own kind of little choreography, and you're 10 men locked in this aluminum tube, and that choreography is important because the camera sees all of it if it's looking down one way or looking back the other way. So you got to pay attention to it, and it helps just to be able to say, "Hey, look, did you see that? Watch that." And in general, they say, "Oh, yeah, we'll shoot that again and make sure we do it." So what I found generally, regardless of what director we were working with on a particular episode, is everybody was very conscious of that. Everybody understood that it was a world made up of minutia in many cases, and that minutia was part and parcel of telling the story.
Yes, and it's also that minutia is I guess all the sort of glue that puts it all together, because it's without that, how are you gonna be really truthful and faithful to how these people lived and what they did?
Yeah, yeah.
One last question, apologies.
Sure.
What was your favorite scene to work on?
There are so many of them. It's difficult to single one out. I loved the shoot down scene when Major Egan, Buck Egan, who is played by Callum Turner, that shoot down scene to me, and how he handled it from the cockpit and the cuts from each position in the aircraft as it was headed into its doom spiral, I think is something I will never forget. I will never forget seeing it cut together, and how you are in the cockpit, then in the waist, then in the nose, then in the tail, then in the ball turret, and everything is just going to hell in a handbasket, and the aircraft is coming apart and it's on fire, and yet he gets most of his crew out of there. That's magic to me. That's the spirit, I think, of the whole series.
It's a solid choice. I know we're very short for time, so Captain Dale, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us. Master of the
Sure.
Air is streaming now on Apple TV Plus. Go watch Captain Dale and his team and everybody else's hard work.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it. It's always good to talk to you, and we'll do it again the next time.
You take care and bye bye.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.